whys of the hows. And so that's usually what I focus on a lot. So let's start with one key thing. Here's sort of our little opener. Sorry, it's like this slow thing. So like I said, I'm always trying to put the fun back in the fundamentals of gardening. I think gardening should be an enjoyable pastime or a hobby or even a professional pursuit if that's something that you want to do. But there's no reason why gardening shouldn't be fun. And I really think that if you understand why certain things are done in the garden, you will not be so sort of reluctant to get out into the garden to do things. And if you get out into the garden more and just sort of by doing gardening, you learn gardening basically. And so I'm always trying to kind of bring people into the garden and help them have a little bit more fun out there and not get so hung up on like worrying about if a plant is going to die or if this is going to work or if that's going to work. And so a lot of it has to do with that. One of the very first basic ideas that I like to talk about in class and that I use to start the book is speaking about, well, we got lots of questions already, the roots and the shoots. As a gardener, you are technically in charge of, you have to remember that you're responsible for the entire plant. Now, lots of times as new gardeners or even experienced gardeners, we tend to focus on the top part of the plant because that's the part that we get to enjoy the most. It has the leaves, it has the pretty flowers, it has the beautiful form of the tree, whatever else it might be. But as the gardener, you are also in charge of the roots of the plant. You're in charge of the entire plant. And the way that plants work is the roots and the shoots balance each other out. They actually help feed each other and help keep each other going. The shoots of the plant, which are the stems and the leaves and the stuff on the top, gather sunlight and through photosynthesis make carbohydrates that create energy to fuel the plant, which they then send down to the roots and allow the roots to grow and get bigger and expand through the soil. And as the roots grow bigger and expand through the soil, then they're able to absorb more water and more mineral nutrients that they can then take up to the top parts of the plant and back into the shoots so they can grow more parts and make more leaves and in turn gather more sunlight and make more carbohydrates as energy and give them to the roots. So they're balancing each other out. So one important thing to understand is if you have a plant that is struggling, so you have a plant that isn't growing too well and there's something wrong with it, it's usually not necessarily a situation going on with the shoots that's an issue. Lots of times it's a reflection of the fact that the roots aren't happy and the roots aren't growing like they're supposed to. And because there's this balance that's going on. So if the roots are strong and vigorous and healthy and expanding through the soil well, then they will grow strong and big and they will in turn make a healthy, vigorous top of the plant. So understanding how the roots and the shoots work is sort of the first kind of key to figuring out how plants grow and how gardeners sort of want to do the things that they do to basically promote that growth. You want big, strong, happy roots, and then you'll have the beautiful shoots and the flowers and the leaves and the form and all that stuff on the top. But you have to understand what's going on underground. To understand what's going on underground, it's kind of an extra slide. Strong roots and shoots produce healthy leaves, flowers, fruits, and seeds. But I want to transition and talk a little bit about what's going on underground. I want to skip the meristems and talk about metabolism just a touch here. If we look here, we see that the plants are photosynthesizing. That's the stuff that's making those carbohydrates and sort of feeding what's going on underneath. Plants also do something called transpiration where they're releasing water in the form of water vapor. But I want to move forward and get to the soil. In order to really understand what's going on underground and the things that a gardener needs to do to make a happy environment for those roots to grow well and in turn make a dynamic kind of, or not a dynamic, but a healthy growing shoot system. I'm already seeing one question about soil being good, but it's heavy and compacted, especially after the rain. What can I do to lighten it up? So somebody out there already sort of understands that soil is kind of an issue. What I want you to think about when you're thinking about the soil and you're thinking about making a a good environment for the roots to grow in so you can grow healthy shoots and the top of the plant, is you need to understand that the soil is a living thing. It's living, it's dynamic, it's fragile, and it's perishable. This is something that I like to talk a lot about when I talk about soil. I do an entire 2-hour lecture on soil in the class, and there's an entire chapter in the New Gardener's Handbook that's dedicated to soil. The thing that you need to remember is that your soil is living, it's alive. There are living ingredients inside of your soil, and this is the organic matter layer. It's the microbes that are living in the soil, and the little bugs and the worms and organic material that falls off of the trees and lands on the ground and works its way into the soil again, and also the roots of the plants that are growing there. So there's living things that are inside of your soil. It's not just this dead medium that stuff just hangs on, just sort of grows in. It won't grow in it if it's not alive. Your soil is also dynamic. Your soil, things are happening in there all the time. Things are changing. Water is moving through it. Nutrients are cycling around. The living ingredients are moving around. They're kind of coming and going and dying and rotting and coming back and doing all sorts of things. So it's a real dynamic system taking place under there. It's not just this kind of dead thing. Because it's living, it is also fragile and perishable. Fragile meaning you can break your soil. You can walk on it too much and structurally compact it. You can drive on it too much. That happens all the time outside of house renovations and things like that. And you can literally break your soil. You can destroy its structure that way. And because it's living, it's also perishable. You can kill it. You can kill the living ingredients that are inside of it. So your soil is alive. It's ever changing and always kind of adapting. It's fragile and it's perishable. So you need to understand kind of a little bit about what's going on underneath there. Move another slide forward. Oh, someone's asking about orchids. Cool.
Someone was asking about whether you can put coffee grounds in the soil. Would that help plants?
Coffee grounds in the soil do help, but they should be composted first. It's okay to sprinkle some coffee grounds on top of the soil, just to kind of, if you don't know what to do with them. But what makes more sense is to compost the add the coffee grounds into your composting in order to let them break down first. Basically, anything that you add to the soil, it's better if it's broken down first. And if we look at something here called the soil food web, this is the living ingredient. These are the living ingredients that live inside of your soil. This is that sort of 5% of living matter that's in any given soil. And it all starts with the detritus, the leaves that fall on the ground. They fall from the trees, they fall from perennial plants, they're old stems from bushes and things like that, all that sort of natural stuff that lands on the ground. If you go out into a natural ecosystem, you see that nobody goes and shows up with backpack blowers and blows all that stuff out, right? It's always collecting and building and creating humus. H-U-M-U-S, not H-U-M-M-U-S, which is hummus, which sometimes people get confused, but it's humus, right? So it's organic matter. And this is actually even basically what compost is. So that detritus is that first ingredient, and from it we get fungi and bacterial microbes that help break it down, and then there we go up to protozoas and nematodes and mites and little critters, and then we get into worms and things like that. So there's this whole soil food web that basically helps create this living soil underneath the ground. So what basically, it's the kind of thing that'll just happen if you allow it to happen. But as a gardener, you can help make it happen. And you make it happen by basically composting. The way I like to say it is humus happens, but composting is made. Compost is made. So humus outside in nature is just going to kind of do its thing and start to develop. But as a gardener, we can make our own humus by doing composting. And the way that we are able to create compost is by, there's a whole sort of science to it, but it's basically adding nitrogen-rich ingredients and carbon-rich ingredients together, which then in turn break down and will form that rich living humus or compost that can be added to your soil to help improve it. So if you have the coffee grounds, like somebody asked, you can add them into your compost pile and let them break down with everything else. Then there was another question I saw about somebody who has a heavy soil. Basically, adding compost to your soil is what's going to improve your soil in all sorts of ways. So if you have a heavy soil and you want to try to lighten it up, in other words, improve its structure, you don't add, basically a heavy soil is typically sort of like a clay soil. You don't add sand in order to make up that difference. You add compost, and the compost will help improve that soil. So that is what you need to start adding to your ground is compost. Typically neglected soils don't have enough organic matter in them, and compost is the first thing to kind of make that start to happen.
And Shirley here is asking whether the soil has to be amended each season. Is that something?
Oh, great question. Great question. I'm going to go back to compost. It does, because it takes a long time for this to happen. And so what we do is when you're trying to improve your soil, and really if there's anything, the best advice I can give to anybody who's going to start a new garden or is already gardening and not seeing the results that they wish they saw, is you probably need to improve your soil. So most soils, especially if it's been under a lawn for many years and it's been treated with synthetic fertilizers and chemical herbicides and pesticides, it's not living anymore. It's actually been killed by all those chemicals, and you need to start getting that living ingredient into the soil. And so compost is the ingredient that you want to add. And what we do is we top dress with compost every season, which basically means putting an inch or two of fresh compost on the garden beds so it can then work its way into the soil naturally. Now, for that very first bed preparation, let's say you're going to go out and you're going to create a new victory garden, which a lot of people are doing, right? Victory garden 2.0. So you want to grow some tomatoes, or you want to grow some lettuce, or you want to do some edibles and things like that. So you find a part of your property that is like a sunny enough spot. You need at least 6 hours of sun to really get your vegetable garden to work. And then maybe it's in a lawn area, so you want to scrape out that lawn area and you want to start improving that soil. That soil is probably structurally compacted. It's probably not very fertile. It probably doesn't hold water very well. It probably doesn't have very much of a living ingredient in it. And so this is when you can add the compost. This is the very first time when you're making a new bed. You put a lot of compost down, maybe 4 or 5 inches of it, and you turn it in. You get it turned in that first time. You're breaking up the structural compaction of the soil. You're getting the soil ready to go, and dig down as far as you possibly can. If you can go down 12 inches, 18 inches, 24 inches, and really loosen all that up, because basically you are setting the stage for the future, because that's the only time that you're going to do that. You're not going to till every single year, because if you till every single year, and I'm going to go backwards here and look at the soil food web, you will destroy that soil food web. You will turn their whole world upside down. And one of the most important parts of the soil food web are the fungi connectors that are growing all underneath there. And every time you till it, you are breaking up all that whole web of fungi that are growing underneath. If you've ever seen those if you've had like a decent soil and you see like little white fungal kind of threads in your soil, that's called mycorrhizal fungi, and they actually help deliver nutrients and water to the roots of plants. They sort of act as an extended root system inside of the soil. So they're great to have. So the last thing you want to do is go flipping all that over and tilling it around. But you can do it the first time because your soil is probably dead under that lawn, and it just kind of breaks up that structural compaction. Then what you do is every year you lay down an inch or two of compost on the surface, and it will work its way in there, because through rain and things like that, it'll sort of melt into the soil and you'll be improving it. You can't overdo it. You don't want to put like 10 inches of this stuff down every year, just a little, just enough. And then every year, year after year, and in 5, 7, 10 years time, you've got yourself a pretty decent garden soil.
There's a couple of other questions about compost here. Can you use sweet peat if you don't have compost? And can you just buy compost?
That's a great question. Sweet peat is basically composted bark mulch with a little bit of peat moss in it. So it's kind of like it's mulch that's already been pre-composted a little bit. So if you have garden beds, ornamental garden beds that are not sort of, the ground isn't necessarily great, using sweet peat as your mulch, if you are still mulching, if you need to mulch, is a good choice because it breaks down really quickly and it's helping and it's improving the soil. So it almost works in place of adding compost because it's such a fine particle already. That heavy bark mulch doesn't break down so quickly, but the sweet peat actually breaks down pretty quickly. And you can buy, yes, you can buy compost in bulk. You buy it by the cubic yard, have it delivered, spread it on your garden. It's usually it's not that easy to make enough compost for a large garden space, just with your veggie scraps from the kitchen and things like that. So if you're trying to kind of revamp some garden beds, you'll probably need to get a delivery of it either in bags or by the cubic yard.
Okay. And can you leave
Anything else?
leaves on the beds in the fall and winter as opposed to cleaning out the
Yes.
beds?
Oh, these are great questions. Everybody's thinking. Yes, you are supposed to leave those leaves on the bed. That's part of that detritus that falls down and helps create the organic matter in the rest of the soil, right? In the soil, it helps break it down and add and sort of turns into humus. So the worst thing to do is go into all your garden beds and with a backpack blower and just start blasting all that stuff out. Then that creates like this sterile environment where you don't have enough organic matter. The crazy thing is when I see people blow all those leaves out, which are perfectly good organic matter, and then they bag them all up and then they put them on the side of the road and somebody takes it away. Whereas, and then what they do then is the next spring they come and they mulch it again. So like there's no reason to take that organic matter away in the first place. Now, if you have 2 feet of oak leaves or something like that sitting on your garden beds, you got to get some of that out of there. Oak leaves don't biodegrade very quickly. A bunch of maple leaves or beech leaves and things like that, they're very thin and they will break down very quickly. And I'll leave them on over the entire winter. Next spring you come, if there are places where it's really kind of thick, you can kind of clean it out a little bit, but let as much of it rot as you possibly can. Don't go cleaning those out. And if you don't like the way that it looks, if you think it looks a little bit messy, and your plants aren't fully kind of filling out the spaces, then you could come and you can put down a little bit of the sweet peat mulch or some other fine textured mulch to kind of clean things up, because there is something nice about that sort of clean, mulched look. But ultimately, you should really only be mulching if the plants aren't well established enough to fill that whole space. And usually the plants won't grow well enough to fill that whole space because the soil isn't good enough and the plants are struggling and their roots can't go anywhere and spread out. And if the roots don't get bigger, then the top of the plant doesn't get bigger because the roots and the shoots need to balance one another out. That's kind of part of the whole thing. Any other soil questions? Let's see, do you see any? Jumping worms, oh brother. Sweet peat, yes. And you can buy compost, yes, okay. So the soil is key to the whole thing to get everything started. And so really if it's a new garden space, you need to think about what the soil is all about and start building a good soil. It can take years sometimes to really make truly excellent garden soil, but you have to start somewhere and start sometime. And you will see a marked difference if you start top dressing with compost every season. It's usually right at the beginning of the year once you can get out there and start working on it. And then a lot of people will even cover the compost with mulch if they need to, but really ultimately the very best mulch is compost. You should just be mulching with compost and not mulching with bark and stuff like that. Big heavy bark mulches and things like that are for getting plants established or for commercial landscaping, like outside of the Target store or something like that, not for your home garden. After when I'm teaching fundamentals and we talk about how plants grow, and then we talk about the soil, and we kind of move through all that, then we start to talk about plant propagation. And this is something that as really every gardener ought to do. There's no reason why as a gardener you can't make a lot of your own plants. So you don't have to go to the garden center to make everything or to buy every plant that you want to grow. You can make your own plants from seeds, and you can also make plants through something that we call vegetative propagation. So every gardener really ought to be propagating. There's no reason why you shouldn't be always able to make more and more plants without having to go to the store and buy them. I know, especially even nowadays, it's a little hard to get to the store to buy them. So a lot of people went crazy with seeds early on. It's really cool and it's really fun to start with seeds. And you can get a packet of lettuce seeds for like $3 and have enough lettuce seeds to kind of get you through the whole season. When I'm growing lettuce, I've already sown some now, so they're going to start, and then when they finish, I'll sow some more again, and I keep sowing them throughout the summer. When it gets a little hot, it gets a little trickier to do your lettuce. You need to have a little shadier, cooler spot, but that's the kind of stuff that you can keep going on and on and on and on. Perennial flowering plants, just ornamentals, you can start lots of them from seeds. Start them in a seed tray, grow them on into smaller pots, and then get them big enough to put them out into the garden, like in those little cell packs and stuff like that. The great thing about growing plants from seed is that the variety that you can get. So if you go to some of these seed catalogs, like Johnny's Seeds or Thompson and Morgan or Illustrated Botanicals or Renee's Seeds or Shepherd Seeds, a lot of these really good seed companies, there's so many other amazing varieties of plants that you can get yourself get a hold of compared to what you can buy at the garden center. So starting seeds is a great way to do it. I like to visit, there's a site called the Seed Savers Exchange, and these are people who collect seeds, gardeners who collect seeds, gardeners from around the country who collect seeds and then offer them up for sale or for trade to other people. So if you're looking for some heirloom tomato or some other kind of interesting flowering plant, this is one really excellent source to do it. And so in the book, we talk a lot about how to go about propagating from seeds. There's a lot of really excellent seed starting information out there, books and things like that. One book that I reference all the time in my class is called The Plant Propagator's Bible, and it talks all about starting from seed. And it also talks about vegetative propagation, which is basically using plant parts to clone your favorite kinds of plants. So I don't know if anybody out there is doing vegetative propagation, but it's really simple. If you look at the slide on the left-hand side, you see a whole bunch of hostas, all divided up. And so you can divide your perennial plants. You can even divide shrubs. Hydrangea shrubs are really easy to divide. You can divide a spirea, you can divide your peonies, things like that, where basically you take the plant out of the ground and you cut it into equal pieces, complete with a root, the crown, which is the connecting piece between the shoots and the roots, and some shoots. And then you've got yourself a whole plant. So for example, a hosta, like the one in the picture there, was probably this big hosta growing in the ground, got too big for its space. They dug it out of the ground and they divided it into, looks like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different pieces. And looking at those pieces, I can see that you could divide some of those pieces into more pieces. This is a great trick if you go to a garden center, once we can kind of go there again and do a little bit more in-person shopping, and you see a plant like this, like a daylily or a hosta or one of these easy to divide plants, and it's in a big giant pot, and maybe it's expensive, maybe it's $25, $30 or something like that. It's in a big pot, but it has lots of shoots. It has a whole bunch of shoots. So you can look at it and be like, aha, I can divide this thing. And so you buy the plant for $30, you take it home, you take it out of the pot, you divide it into 5 different pieces, and you've got yourself 5 full-on plants for the cost of one big plant. So division is something that really any perennial gardener should know how to do and should be doing as much as they can. If you are doing edibles, like there are certain edibles that are easy to divide, like chives. I grow chives in a deck box. And so that's actually a perennial, comes back year after year, and sooner or later it gets too big and I lift it and divide it and plant all the different pieces out. So they divide really easily too. You can also take cuttings. You can just take a clipping from a plant, and because of its growth tissue, which is something called meristematic tissue, which I skipped over that slide because I don't want to get too much into the lesson, you can make that little clipping turn into a completely new plant. In other words, you can take a little clipping from a stem, right? And you cut right below a little growth node. So go outside like today or tomorrow and look at some of your new shrubs, and you might see some new growth on there. Wherever that growth is coming out, that's called a node, and that's a growth point. Cutting right below that node, what happens then is there's growth tissue right in there, lots of undifferentiated cells, stuff that wants to grow. And from that, you can then get that stem to make roots and then have yourself a whole new plant. There's some things that are super easy to do like that, where you just put it in a jar of water and it'll start to make a ton of roots. Coleus is one that's really easy, and there are other ones that are simple too. So cuttings are another one that are really fun to do. We got any good questions floating around out there?
Someone had a question whether it's too late now to grow from seed.
No, it's not. Depending on what you want to grow, it's a little bit late to start something like a tomato from seed at this point. And I usually don't even start my tomatoes from seed. I like to buy them as plants, because tomatoes should be started from seed like sometime back in February or March, because they need to be, if they're like a little plant right now, they're far enough along so they will mature in time through the course of our summer. So you'll be able to harvest. Them. So certain plants I like to get starts on, like eggplant and tomatoes, because they just take more time to develop their fruits. But you can always be starting basil. You can always be starting lettuce. We're getting a little bit late to be starting like radishes or peas or things like that from seed. They could have been started sooner. Though you still might get a little bit of a crop. Depends on how much it heats up. They like the weather to be a little bit cooler. So you could definitely start things. At this point of the year, though, you can think about starting your seeds directly outside and not starting them inside under lights or under glass. Just start it right outside, right off the bat, because our weathers are starting to turn. We're probably not going to get frosts anymore at night, and so we should be okay. And I love starting seeds outside in those trays, because I just put them out there and I forget about them. And I may keep an eye on them, make sure they're getting enough water, but I don't have to tend them as closely as I do with plants that I grow under lights and things like that. There are other propagation techniques that are a little bit more advanced, but are also a lot of fun. There's one called layering, where you're burying the stems of a plant in order to encourage it to make roots. That's sort of like a really old-fashioned form of mound layering right there. And then there's grafting. And grafting is a little bit more sophisticated, but it's actually, once you kind of know how it works and how that growth tissue kind of comes together, it's really pretty obvious. And so here we see that it's typically done with fruit trees, and they're grafting 4 scions onto a single trunk. And then from there, then they can grow things on. Typically, it's plants that cross-pollinate often need to be grafted, like apple trees, because they don't grow true from their seed. So you need to create a clone in order to get the same kind of apple year after year after year. So grafting is one of them. Some other fun things to think about. So now's the time to plant. This is a great time to plant if you can get your hands on some plants. So you've done all the things you wanted to do. You've created the good soil. And you've kind of, you're ready to make a new garden bed, and now you made that garden bed, and now you want to plant it. Oh, I see somebody's asking about vermiculture. I think you mean vermicomposting. You can use the worm poop just like regular compost, basically. Or you can use it as a fertility enhancer anywhere in the garden. It works out pretty cool. So how do we plant? You need to basically make sure that you have the right plant for the right place. That's another spot where some new gardeners can fall down a little bit, where they don't think about their sun exposure. One big thing is understanding your hardiness zone. We here in Connecticut, in this part of Connecticut, we're in a hardiness zone of like a 5 to 6, just depends on how close you are to the sound. Hardiness zone is basically a number. You're given a number. And so if you're in a hardiness zone 6, that means you can buy and plant, you want to buy and plant plants that have a hardiness zone rating of 6 or lower, because hardiness is basically a rating of how cold the average temperature in the winter gets. And so I think in zone 6, it's like 0 to the -5. That's the average coldest temperature. Now it can get colder than that some years and some days, but usually it doesn't stay that colder than that for very long. So if you're living in a zone 6, and you can find out by looking at a hardiness zone map, just Google that, then you want to buy plants that have zone 6 or lower. It means you can grow a zone 5 plant, a zone 4 plant, a zone 3 plant. But if you start trying to grow a zone 7 plant, the winter might get too cold and it might kill it. The next thing to figure out is what's your sun exposure, getting the sun exposure correct for the plant. Some plants like a lot of sun, some plants don't want any sun, and they like a lot of shade. And so you need to understand what's going on in those conditions outside. And really the easiest way to do it is walk outside where you want to plant something and look up. And if you see the sky, you've got a sunny situation. If you see a tree with a bunch of open limbs, and because it's early spring, well, you have to envision that that tree is going to be filled with leaves, and then there's going to be a shadier spot. So there are like interesting techniques for sun mapping, where you can map out all the sun and shade in your garden, and it can be really useful. But if you pay attention at all, like outside at your garden during the course of the day, you'll see where those sunny spots are, you'll see where the shady spots are, and you can plan accordingly. And you can, when you read the tag of the plant, when you buy a plant, it'll tell you sun, shade, or it'll say part shade. Sometimes it'll say both. It'll say sun and shade, and you're wondering what the heck is going on here. Like boxwoods, for example. If you grow boxwoods, they say sun and shade. Well, they prefer full sun, but they can tolerate the shade. That's usually the situation. So you want to basically get a feel for, the trick is if you go to the garden center and the plant that you buy is under the shade tenting, then it's a shade lover. If it's out in the field, out in the lot, in bright full sun, it's a sun lover. And so you want to make sure that it gets enough sun. So don't put it in a really shady spot. If it's a sun lover, it just won't grow right for you. It won't do as well as it ought to. It might live, it might survive, it might muddle along, but it might make 1 or 2 flowers instead of 20, 30 flowers. Just depends on what you're trying to grow. If you have a shady area, and this is useful because so many people are asking me about growing vegetables now. If you don't have any full sun, full sun is 6 hours or more. If you don't have those conditions, it's going to be difficult to do a vegetable garden, but you can grow some veggies in non-full sun situations. But what we're talking about here are not so much fruiting vegetables, but the leafy greens. So you can grow lettuces, you can grow a lot of the herbs, arugula, chives. You can grow a lot of edibles like that, or edibles that make small fruits, like the cherry tomatoes or something. You might be able to get away with it. You're not going to get a ton of them, but you'll get some. So if you don't have the full sun situation that a vegetable garden requires, you can play around with it and grow some things that will do a little bit better. Then
and
the soil.
That has a question here about the sun. Does it make any difference if it's the 6 hours of sun is morning sun or afternoon sun?
Ah, great. I love that question. It's better if it's morning sun. It doesn't make a difference so much, but it is better if it's morning sun, because morning sun is nicer. It's sort of more gentle on the plants. Think of it this way. The plant has been sort of going throughout the course of, with morning sun, a plant wakes up, and it wakes up from the evening. It's still a little dewy outside. It's kind of slowly waking up. It gets to work with the sun hitting it, because when the sun hits the plant is when the plant goes to work. That's when it starts to photosynthesize and do transpiration and everything else. And so then it kind of gets a good, nice morning start. And then later in the day, it gets shady, and then it can relax and be ready for the next day. It's sort of like the perfect work day, right? Whereas the late day sun is different, where the plant the daytime starts, the plant is sort of waking up and kind of doing its thing throughout the day, but not really, full on. And then boom, right at the end of the day, it gets slammed with this late afternoon sun, and it can be a little bit too much for it. Maybe by then the soil has dried out too much, so now it's missing some water that it needs. Or it's kind of like if you went through a whole day of work and you were doing stuff, and then at the very end of the day, somebody gave you another big project that you had to do, and you had to get it done right at the very end. So morning sun is always way more friendly. That western afternoon sun is always a little bit tricky. The very best is to kind of get like some late morning into like the late afternoon, and then kind of finish it off. But we can't all have exactly what we want. Okay, soil conditions, we talk a lot. I don't want to get too far into it, but what we're usually trying to do with the compost is try to make that perfect chocolate cake garden soil. That's so we can grow the most different things. But with our ornamental plants, or even with edibles, understanding what kind of soil we have, we can kind of adapt the plant choices to the soil. So if you have a sandier soil, you can try to grow plants that like that sort of clean drainage. You can grow succulent plants, you can grow ornamental grasses, you can grow sages and lavenders and things like that. You can try lavenders. They're tricky around here. Everyone wants to grow lavender around here, but it's hard. So you can focus on using plants like that. You can grow carrots that are going to grow nice and straight down into the sandy soil. So carrots and radishes and potatoes and things like that. That's why they grow so many potatoes on Long Island. The soil is sandy. These root crops work really well in sandy soil. So if you know you have a sandy soil, instead of trying to fight it, you can work with it. Or maybe you can work with it while you keep adding compost to help improve it. Different things like that. And then also the size of the plant. Understand how big your plants are going to get. The size of a plant is basically a function of growth rate times how long it lives, more or less. So if it grows 6 inches a year and it lives 100 years, it's going to be a pretty big plant, right? It's going to be 50 feet tall. If it grows 3 inches a year and it's a dogwood tree and it lives, 30 years, it's not going to be as big, right? So understand that. Read the tags. Just take a look at the tags and you'll find out a lot, basically. What's next? How do we plant? Let's talk about this a little bit. I think it's useful because it's terrible when people plant something and it doesn't work. Planting the right way. Here's the trick though. If you've done all that preparation and you've created a good bed and you've loosened that soil the first time and it's like this nice stuff in there, the size of the hole isn't all that important. You don't have to create this giant hole to encourage the roots to expand, because basically, whenever you plant a new plant, it's all about getting it established so the roots start to grow. So that first year is all about getting root establishment. If it's a perennial plant especially. You just need the roots to be happy. And so if they get happy, then in turn, the shoots will grow and be happy as well. So the size of the hole is important. If you have kind of crummy soil and you're still working on improving it, make a slightly bigger hole so then the roots can kind of expand their way out a little bit. But if you've done the bed prep, the size of the hole can be roughly the size of that root ball. The depth of the hole is important. In other words, where the shoots and the roots meet together at that crown, that needs to be at the surface of the soil. So don't plant it too deep and don't plant it too high. It's not going to like it that way. It needs to be right at it. And typically the surface in a potted plant, that surface of the potting mix should be level with the ground when you put the plant in the ground. Soil amendments, the vermicompost, the worm poop, that's a great soil amendment that you can add to the planting hole to help encourage root growth. You don't want to make the planting hole too friendly. because you want the roots to leave the planting hole and go into the rest of the ground. So we don't like to put too many amendments into our planting hole. We want just enough to encourage their growth, but then we want them to go the rest of the way out and really sort of start to spread and expand. Backfilling, here's the trick. Here's the trick that this is the difference between a gardener and a landscaper, okay? When you're planting a plant, and you're all gonna be gardeners. I want you all to be gardeners, not landscapers. I want you to function as gardeners. When you dig that hole and you take the plant out of the pot and you put the root ball into the hole, scratch it up a little bit, kind of like rough it up a little bit so there's surface contact between the roots and the soil that's gonna go back in there. And then what I want you to do is I want you to water the plant while it's in the hole before you fill the hole up with soil. Water it then. So you have it in the hole with its root ball, water it, fill that hole all the way up with water, and then let it kind of drain out. And now you've soaked those roots all the way down. Then you start putting the backfill in. The backfill is the soil that you took out of the hole in the first place. That's where I like to maybe sprinkle some fertilizer or something like that, the worm castings, or just some like organic fertilizer, like those Espoma products, plant tone, holly tone, things like that. You can sprinkle it on the backfill, and then you start putting the backfill in, but don't pound on it, don't stomp on it, don't push on it so much as what you want to do is come back with water and water it again and let the water settle that soil, and then add more and let the water settle that soil. And basically what will happen is you fully charge the soil around it with water, because one of the main reasons that plants don't survive and don't make it through is because the roots dry out. And so watering is key. So this is a great way to get them established. And after that, you're going to have to keep up on watering, basically, in order to get it to continue to grow.
And Daryl, we have a couple of questions here about where good local sources are for getting native plants and other plants in the area, and especially during this time, whether they can be delivered. And
yeah, all the nurseries are doing curbside pickup, which is great. So you can get in touch with them. I think now they're starting to open the garden centers so you can actually walk around in there. I think that's starting in some places. What's the native plant? A really excellent native plant source is in Woodbury. It's called, I always want to call it Ecotones, but it's not Ecotones. It's if I remember, hopefully it'll come to me and I'll remember it. They have lots of native plants. Ecotone. Then there's another one near Woodbury called Broken Arrow, which is a really excellent nursery. All garden centers have natives, but they didn't always tout them as being natives. There are a lot of native plants that we grow that we've been growing for a long time, and now they're starting to promote them that way. So I'm kind of blanking on some of the better garden centers that have lots of natives, but like you can go to Pound Ridge Nurseries, or you can go to Sandbridge, or a really excellent one is Oliver in Fairfield, and they have native plants, and they're promoting the native plants because of the importance of natives as for local insect life and as local pollinator plants and things like that. So there are a lot of really good ones that way. So those are some good ones. A lot of the local garden centers have started to close down. They've had a hard time in some of these rougher years, so it's not always works. I'm gonna remember that eco one. It'll come to me in just a second.
Is it Earth Tones?
Earth Tones, thank you. I always want to call it eco. Yeah, it's Earth Tones. They're great. They have everything, but remember, that's a true propagating nursery, which means everything's going to be really. You're going to be starting with small sizes, sometimes like quart size and things like that, which is great, actually. I like starting with smaller plants and not starting with really big, expensive ones. So yes, Earth Tones, that's the one. And you can just order it all, and then you go through their catalog and order what you think you want, and then they'll just have it ready for you curbside to come and pick up. I know that they do that. And then for your veggies and herbs around here, I go to Gilberti's in Westport. They're amazing. They sell to all the other garden centers, so that's just going directly to the source. And they they do curbside too. I just went there for a client and picked up some stuff for them. So
Great, thanks.
yeah. What's next? Mulching. So we talked a little bit about soil. Mulching is necessary for a lot of different reasons. It regulates the soil temperature, conserves soil moisture. Those are really important for new plantings. So we always want to mulch our new plantings. In other words, add mulch around new plantings for our ornamentals. Vegetable gardens are something different. We don't necessarily need to mulch around our vegetable gardens plants, but I still do, but I use a different kind of a mulch. So our ornamental plants will be mulching maybe with sweet peat or a shredded bark mulch or something else like that, or if you're doing it right, compost. But in my vegetable garden, I will often mulch with straw to help keep down weeds and conserve the moisture on the soil, because the soil will dry out really quickly if it's not covered up with something. It also will, weeds will start to germinate really quickly if the soil isn't covered, because the sunlight wakes up the weed seeds. So I like to mulch a vegetable garden with a little bit of shredded straw. You can buy the bales of it. The reason I use it is it breaks down really quickly, and you can just kind of end up working it back into the soil after you harvest. And then it's just adding more organic matter. Or even if you use like a bale, if you buy a bale of straw, make sure it's straw, not hay. Hay will have seeds in it, so it has to be straw. And if you use a bale and it's big pieces of straw, then it's really easy to rake out. So it's really simple. Other reasons why we mulch in the garden is to prevent soil erosion. It's adding that organic matter, which as it breaks down over time, it's improving your soil bit by bit every year. It looks nice in a landscape space, that sort of spring look. But ultimately, you know, your plants should be taking over, and you shouldn't have to be mulching so much year after year after year. Mulching is important that very first year. It helps get the plant established. But you shouldn't have to mulch every single year. You shouldn't have to put, and mulching basically, it should be about 2 inches, 2 to 3 inches of mulch should be enough. If it's sweet peat, that's all going to biodegrade by the end of the year and be gone. But if it's a coarser mulch, that should last a while. For example, I will use cedar mulch around a tree, a brand new tree, because it's not going to break down very quickly. Cedar doesn't rot very readily, so I can mulch it once and it'll last there 3 or 4 years with cedar. So you there's a lot of different kinds of mulches that we can use. You know, you can use just the leaves from the fall can be your mulch. That works too. So there's lots of different things that we use. Here are some of these other things. So shredded bark, bark chips, stone, straw, leaves. But the very best mulch of all is compost. If you're mulching every year with a fresh top dressing inch or so of compost, basically you do that because all your plants, everything comes up, and then you don't see the ground anymore. That's basically the design of a real garden, because that's how nature works. That's how things work in the wild. If you go out into the wild, there's no unexposed soil unless there's some erosion going on. Every bit of ground is covered with a plant, because a plant will, and the reason being, something is always going to want to grow somewhere. And so you want it to be the plant that you want to grow there, because if you don't have a plant that's growing there, you're going to have a weed that's growing there. So you want to make sure it's the plant that you want. And so I always want my plants to grow healthy and strong, so they all start to fill in and knit together, and I don't have a bunch of space in between the plants. Vegetable gardens are different. You're sort of harvesting and cleaning out and then replanting and harvesting. You should go through several cycles of a vegetable garden where you're kind of rotating crops and things like that. What else do we got? When you do it after planting, spring prep or fall refreshing, there's that dreaded pile of mulch in the driveway that nobody wants to see. When it comes to mulching, you do it when there's bare soil. You need to cover the ground, either with, and if a plant isn't coming up yet, you need to put some mulch down. I like to play around with annuals and seeds and stuff like that to try to cover the ground with as many plants as I can and not so much mulch. Do we want to talk about water? What do you think? I want to talk a little bit about irrigation, why automated irrigation is bad for you, the planet, and your plants. Though there are smarter irrigation systems out there. I've been learning about some new systems. One is called HydroWise, which seems pretty sophisticated, and it really reads the weather that's around it. And that's my beef with irrigation systems, is that they aren't smart enough to know when's the right time to water. What happens then is gardens get watered when they don't need it, or they don't get watered when they do need it. And ultimately, the system kind of falls down a little bit. Lots of times what happens is they set up these systems so they run very, like, for 10 or 15 minutes or 10 minutes every day. So they're continually sort of adding moisture into the soil. The thing is, if you want to water correctly, you want to water, oops, sorry, I didn't mean to do that. Let's bring that back up. You want to water long and deep, not short and sweet. So you need a good soaking. So you need a good soaking rain, not a little bit of water every day. Because if you really soak, if the soil gets really fully soaked and fully charged with moisture, then the roots will be able to expand and spread their way out. And you will have larger root system, which will in turn result in a larger shoot system. If you just give a plant a little bit of water every day, it never has any impetus to really spread its roots out. So you're just always kind of giving it what it needs, you know, just the day's worth, and it's not going to expand itself. And if the roots never get bigger, then the shoots never get bigger. And so a lot of water gets wasted, sometimes in irrigation systems. That's another thing. But mostly the plants don't really like it. I see sprinkler systems where the spray is hitting right up against the shrub, and then the shrub is getting a fungus, and it sort of can cause more problems than it's worth. Typically, I stay away from irrigation systems except for lawns, where spray heads like we see here are something that work, or I use only drip irrigation inside of garden beds as a like insurance policy against droughts and things like that. Any other cool questions? How are we doing? I'm willing to keep going.
What do you think about ornamental grasses in our area?
Stay away from miscanthus grass. That's sort of invasive a little bit, so we don't like to use those. We like to use the native, I mean, they're not so native around here, but like blue stem grasses or panicums and drop seeds and things like that. I love ornamental grasses. They're pretty great. I use them for lots of things, and they tend to be kind of drought tolerant. They're sort of low maintenance plants. You just cut them back in the spring and let them do their thing, and you don't have to like be always playing around and staking them. Though sometimes they'll start to hollow out in the middle, and that's when they need division. A lot of the fountain grasses do that. You'll see if you look at them now, they may have a hollow center, and then it's sort of like all growing in a ring. That's when it's telling you to lift it and divide it. That's sort of the same thing. I think somebody was asking about their iris, like when's a good time to lift and divide them. If you ever see a plant like that that has like it's hollowing out in the center and nothing's growing there anymore and everything's growing like in a ring, that's when it needs to be divided. That's the time to do it.
Someone has a question here about planting on a rocky slope in a part shade area.
Oh, brother. Yeah, that's rough. Depends on how rocky it is, but really, like, it's your plant selection that's going to be the key to the whole thing. So there's a plant called barrenwort. The botanical Latin is Epimedium, Epimedium, Epimedium. It's a dry shade loving plant, a ground cover that will sort of hold your slope together. You could also use spacing on it. Lamium is another one, Lamium. It's also called dead nettle, but there's some really pretty ones, and they like dry shade too. So you have to try to find the right plant that's going to work. You want to kind of hold the soil together using the plants and sort of get things established and get them going in there. And maybe do a little amending to kind of improve it if you can. We can talk a little bit about, I want to kind of give you the basics about fertilizer. Basically, whenever I talk about fertilizer in the garden, I'm talking about organic fertilizer. I'm not, we don't want to use synthetic fertilizers on our garden soil. Synthetic fertilizers are the Miracle Grow stuff. Basically, um, synthetic fertilizers are part of what kills the living ingredient in the soil. So they destroy and damage all those little fungi, fibers and stuff like that. And so we always want to stay away from using synthetics on the garden if we want to promote a living soil. So we use organics. And so the popular ones around here are those Espoma products. Any of the Espoma products that have the word tone at the end of it, T-O-N-E, that's an organic. And you'll look and there'll be these numbers will be on the bag. Numbers that relate to what are the NPK numbers, which are nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. These are major macronutrients that all plants need quite a bit of in order to grow. The first number is going to be the percentage of nitrogen in the bag. So 100 pound, or say it's a 10-pound bag, 4% nitrogen. That's let's say it's a 100-pound bag, 4% nitrogen is going to be 4 pounds of nitrogen. So it's kind of a percentage thing. Phosphorus is the second number. That's the 6 in this particular illustration. That's the middle number. And potassium is the third number. Nitrogen is what makes leaves. It's what makes the plant green. It makes foliage. So a nitrogen fertilizer, a higher nitrogen fertilizer is good if you're growing lettuce, or if you're growing an evergreen plant where it's about the needles of the pine tree, or a boxwood, because you don't really grow a boxwood for its flowers, right? The phosphorus is for its flowers. So if you are growing tomatoes, if you're growing dianthus flowers or cone flowers, or if you're growing an eggplant or a pepper, because basically what happens is the flower turns into the fruit, and so phosphorus makes flowers and fruits. So basically you need phosphorus for your tomatoes and your eggplants and stuff like that to come in. And then potassium is good for roots. It also helps with sort of the entire plant in general, but it also is helping make roots. So we tend to kind of focus on these three numbers. It's good to understand what these numbers mean when you look at a bag of fertilizer, so you kind of know what you're getting. If it has a really big first number, it's going to be for a lawn or something like that. And then if you're going to be able to tell if it's a synthetic, if those numbers are above 10 and if they're very regular. So in other words, 10 10 10, 30 10 10, 25 10 5 or something like that, these are going to be synthetic fertilizers. But if it's these lower, like single digit random numbers like 4 6 3, that's going to be something that's going to be an organic fertilizer. How are we doing?
We're doing good.
Okay, I'll keep going.
Yeah.
Any questions about fertilizer in there?
What do you recommend for azalea fertilizer?
Oh, something with a higher middle number. So there's something called, the Spoma makes a product called Rose Tone. That has a slightly higher phosphorus number, the middle number. And so I use it for pretty much everything, because phosphorus also helps make roots. So I use Rose Tone for all the plants. I don't bother with all the other different kinds. They're all kind of the same. They're not that different. So like if you have an old bag of holly tone sitting in the garage, it's okay to put it on your roses. It's okay to put it on your vegetable garden. It's gonna work. It's just fine. I just buy one and kind of go from there. Yeah. Ooh, can you mulch a vegetable garden with grass clippings? I wouldn't do it. The grass clippings are too hot. They're gonna kind of cook on there. And so you would want to compost them first, and then you could put them down. Oh, mail order tree seedlings from Arbor Day Foundation. No, they're not so great. It's gonna be that little tiny twig, and the only one that'll live will be the crabapple. So these questions are great. I'd almost rather just like crank through the questions.
You can do that if you like.
Yeah, how do you shred leaves? When should you prune holly bushes? Prune them basically they get pruned in June, after the new growth hardens off. So prune them sometime in June. They'll make a bunch of new leaves, and then those leaves will turn dark green like everything else. And let's see, I'm gonna go through this. We'll just kind of do my happy gardening logo and the book, and I'm just going to answer questions because I know we're here at 4 o'clock. We might start losing people. Pruning the holly bushes. Yeah, so wait until the new growth hardens off, and then they're better to be sheared, but you can prune as much of it off as you possibly want. I mean, it'll be fine. It'll grow back. One little note, always feed after you prune, because the plant is going to need to do a lot of growing afterwards, and it's going to want some fertilizer to grow. Colored mulches. Yes, there is a problem with colored mulches. They have like weird chemicals in them to make them that color. Plus they're in my mind, not aesthetically pleasing. So, but the main thing is the stuff that they put in there to make them that color, and then that's leaching into your soil. One thing that you want to understand is, and this is especially true for anything you put down on your vegetable garden beds, is the plants technically are eating what's in the soil to make their parts. And then if you eat a plant, you are basically eating whatever is in that soil. So you have to be very careful and very cautious about what you put on your soil if it's for a vegetable garden or something like that. Drip irrigation in vegetable garden. I use soaker hoses. I don't use permanently installed irrigation in a veggie garden. I just go to the hardware store and buy soaker hoses. And because you're bound to hit them, and it's cheaper to replace them than it is to replace the permanent install. And they're dark, they're like a dark black, and so they're easier to kind of hide. Trout lily for a ground cover. Yes, I just put a whole bunch of those in a garden. Great for deep shade. They're excellent. I love those. Rotating crops in a veggie garden. Oh, take the vegetable garden Saturday at NYBG. Saturday, May 30th, we're going to have the vegetable gardening 101 and 3 sessions actually on a single day. So we can talk a little bit more about that there. Lamium can be invasive, but it's usually not. I never had too much trouble with it. It's too easy to kill. Let's see. Clay soil, add compost to help your clay soil. Hollyhocks. Oh, it's probably a fungus. For my hollyhocks, how can I prevent the buds falling off and the leaves sort of rusting? That's a fungal disease. And so if you have any plants that tend to get fungal problems in the season, like roses or peonies or hellebores or anything else like that, you spray them now to inoculate them with a fungicide. You can't stop the fungus once it's already happening, but you can prevent it from happening in the first place. That's one of our key things about pests and disease. Spray them now, get yourself a nice organic, safe fungicide, and you can spray them and you probably have a better chance. Planktone as a general purpose fertilizer, it's excellent. Can you use kelp? Yes, kelp is a good organic matter add into the soil. So there's nothing wrong with it. How long is a fertilizer bag good for? It's really good forever, more or less. Sometimes they put living ingredients inside of it. Like if you see an Espoma product and it says it has biotone in it or something like that, that's a living microbe. And sometimes they have mycorrhizal fungi in there too. That stuff loses its charge after about a year. So you don't want to buy an old bag. You don't want to buy a bag from last year at the store, and the bag that you kept in the garage for a couple of years doesn't have that living stuff anymore, but it still has the nitrogen, the phosphorus, the potassium, and all the other nutrients that the plant needs. So it's fine. Oh, chipmunks making holes. Oh, I don't want to. Any suggestions to help strengthen dogwood trees? Wow, it's probably a Cornus, Florida, and they are just not doing well anymore around here. I think with changing climate and other issues, plus they've been kind of overused. The best thing that you can do really is to feed them and try to nurse them along, but also understand that dogwood trees don't live as long as a lot of other trees. They're sort of like a 30 or 40-year tree. So if they're getting to be into their 40s or 50s, they don't live forever. Plants are the same way. Yeah. How do you kill black swallowwort? Oh no. Oh, can you put wood ash from a wood stove into a compost pile? Yes, but not too much. It's potassium. So it's okay to add, but don't overdo it. So you may have a lot of wood ash and you don't want to put so much of it in there. But if you have a big giant composting pile someplace, like a big heap, then you can add more. But if it's a smaller composting pile, just a few cups of this stuff is all you're going to want to do. So you can't always use it all up that way. I'm not sure what black swallowwort is, so I can't answer that particular question. I do local projects, yes. What are the good bugs and bad bugs? Oh, ladybugs, assassin bugs, praying mantis, those are good bugs. Lacewings and a lot of the, what's the one of the, like the hornworm and stuff like that. These are considered bad bugs. Really, any bug is it's kind of hard to sort of say good bug, bad bug, but there are some bugs that cause a lot more damage. And there are the good bugs. The good guy bugs are basically the bugs that we know of that eat other bugs. That's kind of how we do the math on that kind of stuff. This is one of the reasons why we don't like to spray with pesticides, because they kill the good bugs as well as the bad bugs. So you certainly don't want to be spraying willy-nilly. Should I deadhead my roses? If they are hybrid tea roses, yes. Deadhead them and you will get more roses. Yep, for sure. Keep cutting them as they finish. Bring them inside and make a display. What can you do for older bushes that are not growing evenly? Bottom is bare, but there's new growth on the top. Oof. Depends on the shrub, but basically you need to do what's called a rejuvenation pruning, which means basically cutting it down to the ground and allowing it to come back again. One of the books that I talk about it in the New Gardener's Handbook, but there's some excellent pruning books out there. There's one, it's called Cass Turnbull's Pruning Manual or Pruning Guide. CASS, TURNBULL. She's really good. Let's see, what else? Oh, that's the end of the slideshow. I'm trying to move this down. Anything else, Lindsay? I don't know. We want to keep going?
What about 2 more questions from the list, and then we'll call it a day.
Let me find a good one. What was the ground cover you said you just planted in the shade? Epimedium, barrenwort, or lamium, and also toad lilies work great in the shade. My old hydrangeas don't bloom much anymore. No, you can do a rejuvenation pruning and feed them with phosphorus and try to get them to bloom again. Getting rid of moles and voles. Oof, there's a whole thing to that. Oh, here's a good one. When should seedlings started in peat pots be transferred to outdoor pots? As soon as there's no more frost. And actually, also, it's best to get those seedlings moved once they start making true leaves. That's really the signal for them to get out of that little peat thing into a bigger pot. That's kind of the main signal. And then we'll finish it with, when is your next class at NYBG and when does the next series start? The Fundamentals of Gardening starts again on May 12th. There's going to be a new section starting on May 12th where you'll get like the full kind of idea of what this lectures of the lectures that I give is sort of covering it a lot more in depth than we were able to do today. So May 12th, I think, is when we start another section. But then there's also there's a container gardening weekend coming up on the 9th. And then another veggie garden weekend on the 30th. And hopefully, I do thank you all for coming and visiting and being part of the webinar. We kept pretty much everybody in. I know some people had to leave, but there's still a lot of you out there, 80 people. It's amazing. So thank you for that. I hope if you want to learn a few good tricks of how the why-dos or the how-tos, you'll take a look at the New Gardener's Handbook. I know that it's available from our co-sponsor for the event. And it's also probably at the library, I'm thinking, but once we can get back to the libraries, you can always check it out at the library.
Yeah.
So thank you. Thank you, everybody. And thank you, Leslie.
Thank you so much, Daryl. Thanks a lot. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye. See how I can quit the meeting
Stop
here?
sharing.
There we
There
go.
we go.